Ready?
Yeah. Yes.
Ready to go? Welcome to this morning's program and today's program on getting the lead out of drinking water. This is a topic that has been of interest to many people, but I think is a little less understood. Over many years, there's been a lot of effective focus on lead paint, lead removal from properties. This is a complementary set of issues that do relate. And this is an interesting program that we've put together. My name is Vincent Dixon. My co-chair, Arpa Funding of the Environmental Justice Committee of the Mystic Valley Area Branch of the NAACP, and we are the co-sponsors. I want to just briefly note my partner, Emily Ann, who has helped me with some of the work on this project, and appreciate the people who came in on a Saturday morning. And this program is being recorded so that people know that, and will be available online in various formats in coming weeks so that people who didn't have the opportunity to come will be able to see it. We thank those who may be online as well for this program. The publicity of the last week has been heavily substantial at the national level on the federal infrastructure bill. It has now been passed and signed into law by President Biden, and that bill does provide for billions actually of dollars for lead supply removal in various pipes and various mentalities. One of the issues you'll hear about today is obtaining information about the property you live in or may own and how to do that, and that's part of a larger set of issues in terms of record keeping and public access. And I thank everyone for coming. And now I will turn it over to my co-chair, Arpa Funding, to introduce our program.
Thank you, Vincent. I will open this presentation with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the history of genocide and forced removal that First Nation peoples experienced at the hands of white settlers and continued harmful impacts of colonialism. In Malden, we acknowledge that the land that we live, work, learn, and commune on is the original homelands of the Pennacook and Massachusetts First Nations peoples. We honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land in our communities. Now I'll introduce Moreo. Originally from New Mexico, Moreo was introduced to the environmental justice movement in high school and spent time organizing around clean energy replacement in predominantly communities of color. While attending college in Western Massachusetts, Moreo joined the Clean Water Action Canvas office in Northampton, going door to door, organizing people around important local and environmental issues. After graduating in 2017 with a bachelor's in government, Moreo spent some time training others as door-to-door organizers before taking a program role in the Boston office focusing on creating local campaigns focused on lead in drinking water. Moreo currently serves as Associate State Director of Clean Water, Massachusetts. He is still focused on lead and drinking water and works to prioritize environmental justice communities that bear a disproportionate burden when it comes to environmental impacts. Moreo believes that care of the environment is, at its core, a social justice issue. Therefore, Moreo works to center underprivileged communities in ways that interrupt racism, classism, sexism, and other institutional oppressions. Now, without further ado, Moreo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Morning. Can you hear me all right? How about folks on Zoom? Can you hear me all right? You can give me a thumbs up if you can. Yep. All right, great. Welcome. I'm so happy and excited to be here with all of you today. This is my first hybrid presentation since COVID, so thank you for being my lovely test audience, I'm usually a little bit more out in front of a crowd, so adjusting as well. But I'm really, really glad to be here today, and I'm really honored to be able to partner with the NAACP Mystic Valley Area Branch on this, because lead in drinking water, like all environmental justice issues, is fundamentally a racial justice and an economic justice issue as well. People of color often serve as canaries in the coal mine for environmental pollution and other toxic exposure issues that really do impact all of us. Unfortunately, that impact is not equal and often falls disproportionately on communities of color. And we have, unfortunately, so many examples of that. So before we get into our topic, which is lead in drinking water, I want to really firmly root us in the justice piece. And can folks hear me all right? I just want to check because I know with the mask it can be difficult. Okay, great. So Hurricane Katrina, one of the most devastating storms to ever hit the mainland of the United States of America, was also more devastating than it needed to be. This is a situation where that actually goes back all the way to the days of slavery in the United States, where recently freed, formerly enslaved African Americans were intentionally placed in areas with poor infrastructure, often unhygienic, places like swamps, flooding, and as a result, when serious natural disasters hit, are more vulnerable. When you pair that with local governments not always being able to or being willing to prioritize things like storm infrastructure to make sure that cities are secure in events like flooding, you get situations like this where people are left for days in really inhumane conditions without access to resources and aid. Also in Louisiana, Cancer Alley, where the St. James Parish, most well known as Cancer Alley, has a population mostly African American and people of color, low income, that are next to dozens of toxic polluting power plants and other toxic energy facilities, leading to rates of cancer much higher than we see in most other areas in the country. And these folks have been fighting for a long time to bring attention to that issue. But people of color aren't just victims of environmental racism. We also have a long history of being advocates and community organizers, trying to make our communities healthier and safer for everyone. People are probably familiar with Native American protesters who do a lot to protect water. And this is a long tradition in Indigenous communities. In fact, despite comprising less than 5% of the world population, Indigenous communities actually protect over 80% of the biodiversity on Earth. And you also have advocates for clean drinking water in places like Flint, Michigan, which is probably the first place that really busted open the issue of lead in drinking water so that it became a national awareness, and it was already a national crisis, which we're going to get into a little bit later. But before we talk lead in drinking water, I also want to talk just about water, period, because I like to ground us not in just what's bad about the world, but what's really beautiful about the world and kind of what the world can do just on its own. And the other thing that I want to frame the presentation with throughout is that we're going to get into a lot of topics that seem kind of complicated. They seem kind of technical, and they might even seem a little bit scary and overwhelming. So I just want to remind people that this is how we start nationwide conversations in rooms like this. All it takes is a few people getting together, learning about an issue, and then spreading that awareness throughout their community. A few residents in Massachusetts can spark statewide conversations, and those conversations can spark national policy changes that we're actually seeing right now. I am a water guy, and I promise not to give you too many water puns, but I do want to say that oftentimes I like to think about conversations like these as ripples, where we just start with one person, one action, one conversation, and that conversation ripples out across the country, across the world, and it leads to the kind of systemic change that we're seeing people calling for every day, more and more. And to go with this, I love the quote from Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So if you're looking around the room and it's feeling a little bit sparse, this looks just fine to me. So let's talk water. Sorry, I went too far. There we go. Oh no, too far again. I have a lot of talents. PowerPoint isn't really one of them. It's just really slow. I don't want to keep clicking it because then it's gonna do the thing it did before. There we go. Water is a very precious and limited resource. So 97.5% of all the water on this earth is actually salt water, which is very difficult to treat and turn into drinking water. It's also very expensive and uses a lot of resources and energy. So that means that we only have 2.5% of all the water on earth that is fresh water. But 79% of that is actually trapped in ice caps and glaciers. And it's very hard to access. What this ends up breaking down to is that actually only 0.5% of all of the water on earth is available for fresh drinking water. And unfortunately, of that 0.5%, we don't use most of it for drinking. Most of it right now actually goes to our public power because we need to spend huge amounts of water creating steam in big power turbines to generate electricity. The next biggest use of our water is in irrigation to feed both crops and to feed both humans and animals that we use for food. And then the third greatest source of water ends up being our public drinking supply. Now, I always try to strike a balance in these conversations. My goal isn't to scare people. My goal isn't to spread misinformation that freaks people out. My goal is to be really honest about the issues that we face and the ways that we all have power to change those issues. And I also don't want to make it seem like we have bad water in Massachusetts. That's really too simplistic, and phrases like that don't actually help people. What does help people and empower people is information and knowledge, so you know exactly where your water sources are coming from and what challenges we face to make those water sources better in the long term. One thing that I forgot to say for the folks on Zoom, whenever you see this little this little water drop icon, that means you've got a poll coming up. I know it can be hard to have people meeting in person and then have you online. So this is a way for you to stay engaged throughout the presentation. And our awesome intern NG is also looking at the chat. So feel free to type in questions and she'll let me know whether or not when people ask questions that I can answer them live here. So I want a quick show of hands. And for folks on Zoom, you've had a poll. How many people think we have good water in Massachusetts? All right, a few. How many people think we have bad water in Massachusetts? How many people really just don't know? Yeah, super fair. So the good news is we have some of the best drinking water in the country, actually. In Eastern Massachusetts, we get our water from two sources, the Quabbin Reservoir and the Wachusett Reservoir. And what's great about this is that it's naturally filled with water and snow throughout the year. In fact, the Quabbin Reservoir can hold up to 5 years worth of drinking water all by itself. The other great thing about these reservoirs is they're protected by watersheds where that are mostly forests, swamps, and wetlands that can't be built on, which means that those reservoirs are naturally contained by land that is largely unpolluted, which means that even before the water is treated, which we'll get to in a second, it's really clean. It also filters into that reservoir through rivers and streams, making its way through soil, rock, plant matter. And that was nature's original water filter. It filters out a lot of contaminants just naturally. So as water makes its way from the reservoir into treatment plants, it also generates energy, which I think is pretty cool, hydroelectric power, both when it enters and exits. And and then we get to the treatment stage, which we're going to talk about now. So I want people to picture a giant glass of water. And I want to talk about what we do to that water to make it safe and drinkable. So first of all, the MWRA, Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, performs over 1,600 water samples per month. So a lot of people are paying attention to the water you drink, is the good news. We've already talked about water from the Quabbin Reservoir and the Wachusett Reservoir, two of the least polluted water sources there are. And this serves 200 million gallons per day to consumers like us. The issue, and it's also treated with things to get rid of giardia. It's treated with things to make sure that it doesn't corrode the pipes, which is really important. And we're going to talk about that more throughout the presentation. But then I want you to picture that this beautiful, clean, giant glass of water gets plopped in this kind of dirty metal straw. And that's sort of the issue that we're facing with drinking water, with lead in drinking water. The water is clean, it's lead-free when it makes its way out of the storage facilities, but it's being filtered for some people through aging water pipes that are made of lead. And this can contaminate otherwise clean drinking water. And this is what that looks like. So this is the distribution system. It makes its way through the water main and then is delivered into individual houses through water service lines, some of which are still made of lead. So let's talk about lead for a second. Lead is a heavy metal that was used in different products since ancient Rome. The reason they started using it is that lead is more bendable than lots of other metals. So in theory, it's kind of ideal for making piping where water needs to curve in all kinds of these wacky ways. Unfortunately, what the Romans didn't know at the time is that exposure to lead causes many serious health problems. And it's been banned in lead plumbing for a long time, fairly long time. But unfortunately, it's still present in many homes for reasons that we're going to discover together today. In fact, lead in plumbing was so common that the word for lead in Latin is actually plumbum. That's where the word plumbing comes from, because lead was so synonymous with pipes that we actually named plumbing after lead. So let's talk about some common ways that you can be exposed to lead. There's usually one that comes to mind for people first. Does anyone want to shout out what that is? What do you think of when I say lead exposure? Paint. Yep, exactly. So paint tends to be one that we talk about a lot. And it's also one that the most kind of legislation and policies exist to get rid of and protect people from. Unfortunately, lead is not biodegradable. So what that means is that it stays in the environment really for thousands of years. And so even when we get rid of that paint, little chips of it can settle into dust or from other sources. And we actually have lead in soil as another serious exposure out for lead. But we are here today to talk about lead in plumbing. And this is an issue that didn't get as much attention up until Flint, Michigan. And there are different reasons for that. But the bottom line is that even though people often aren't chronically exposed to lead through water in the same way as paint, the advice that you give people who have homes with lead paint is just don't let any kids be there, because kids tend to put everything in their mouths. And that's a major route of exposure for lead, is that oral ingestion. I can't tell you not to put lead in drinking water in your mouth. That's kind of the point. So we have this situation where even though drinking lead in your drinking water at semi-low levels isn't going to put someone in the hospital, it can still lead to really serious health effects long-term, which is why we want to get it out. And you're going to hear me say get the lead out a lot. I would encourage people to say it with me, especially the more we say it throughout the presentation. So here's some sources of contamination for lead in drinking water. We've got leaded solder, which is basically used to connect pipes together. That was banned in Congress in 1986, the same time that they banned lead pipes. And also that they banned lead in paint. We also have leaded alloys. This is basically where you add lead to other kinds of metal like brass to make it easier to cut. In 1986, they limited lead content in alloys to 8%. And then in 2014, they lowered that number even more to 0.25%. Maybe that's a better place for it. And then you've got water pipes, lead service lines. And that's what we're here to talk about today, because that is the most significant source of lead in drinking water. Second. Oh, and one thing that I forgot to mention is that lead in drinking water through water service lines is really common in homes. A lot of people ask me about lead in schools. That usually comes from leaded solder and those alloys that we talked about, because it's inside the plumbing and the walls itself. Usually water service lines need to be bigger for schools than the lead lines usually are. And so people often ask me about this. So I've just started saying that it's the same issue in terms of lead in drinking water, but the actual source and the approach to getting rid of it is a little bit different. And one thing I should also say is if your house was built before 1986, definitely get it checked for a lead line. But what we see is that it's most likely that it's houses built prior to 1940 that are most likely to be hooked up to lead service lines. But unfortunately, that's still a lot of houses in Massachusetts. So let's talk about what happens when you have a lead service line. First of all, there are a lot of lead service lines out there. And unfortunately, we don't know where they all are. It's estimated that there are between 6 to 10 million lead service lines around the country. And again, that number could be higher. And it's estimated that there are about 220,000 lead lines in Massachusetts alone. What happens when you have an old lead pipe is that pipe eventually corrodes. As it gets older, little bits of lead break off from inside of the pipe and they travel through the drinking water into our bodies. Now, even though that our drinking water is treated with anti-corrosive chemicals, which does make a big difference, it basically means that we're being exposed to much lower levels of lead than we otherwise were. There is still some amount of lead in drinking water that makes its way through the drinking water into our bodies. And that's a really big problem. It's a problem for everyone, as we're going to find out, but it's specifically a problem for children and for people who are pregnant, because lead really impacts child development. Unfortunately, going back to this is also a racial justice issue. Black children are still twice as likely than non-Black children to have elevated blood lead levels in the first place. So this brings me to a question, and you're going to get to cheat a little bit because the slide already came up. What's the safe level of lead in drinking water? Yeah, 0. There's no safe level of lead in drinking water. You'll hear that from the EPA. You'll see that in different websites. Does anyone want to guess what the actual drinking water standard is? That means how much lead is allowed in water before someone is legally required to do something about it. It's not 0, unfortunately. It's 15 parts per billion. And I want to talk to you about that for a second. So we have a table. Sorry, this is really annoying. I just don't know how to get rid of it. So I'm just going to move it around as I need to. Maximum contaminant level goal. Goal is the key word here. This is based on what is actually scientifically safe for humans to ingest. Then you have an action level. That is also pretty self-explanatory. It's the level of lead in which you need to actually legally take action to deal with it. That is that level is determined by what's feasible. And that basically means, does the technology exist to fix the problem, and how expensive is that technology, and will it bankrupt cities and water systems all around the country if they have to do it? The EPA works to get the action level as close as possible to the maximum contaminant level goal. But to put it really simply, what I'm trying to say to you is that even though the safe level of lead in drinking water is 0 parts per billion, the level of lead that can be in the water isn't 0 parts per billion, it's 15 parts per billion. And what that means is that a lot of people are going to be exposed to lead in drinking water at low levels until we find a way to actually get the lead out at its source. Another important distinction is that a maximum contaminant level goal, as I've said before, it's not enforceable, even if you get a lead test that shows you at, say, 10 parts per billion. Not anything has to happen, although that's going to change soon. When you do have to take action is if 10% or more of those samples are above the action level. And once that happens, cities have a few different options, depending on how many years in a row water samples came back above the elevated level, depending on whether or not they've already got corrosion control. Cities always have to do a public notice and some public education. If they haven't already put in corrosion control to basically slow the rate of decay inside pipes, they have to do that. And then only after those steps are taken are cities actually legally required to start replacing lead service lines. And that's a problem, because even small amounts of lead are harmful to the human body. That's because lead is something known as bioaccumulative, where even small amounts of toxins can build up in the body over time. And for lead, that time is really long. So lead is stored differently in different parts of the body. In the blood, it only circulates for about 30 days, or half of the lead in your system, circulates in your body for 30 days. So that means that after 30 days, you basically have half as much lead in your system as when it was first introduced. In soft tissue like organs, that number goes up to 40 days. But the real issue here is that lead is stored in the bones for up to 30 years. That means that even if someone is exposed when they're 10 years old, they could be 40 years old by the time that half of that lead has disappeared from their system. And unfortunately, this is an issue that can come back later in life, because as we age, we lose bone mass. And what that means is that as calcium is released from the bones, as those bones lose mass, that lead is reintroduced into our system. So this is particularly an issue for pregnancy, because mothers are able to pass lead with calcium to the fetus. And this is also an issue for menopause. As women age, they lose bone mass. And so that's another issue, because again, lead is entering back into the body at higher rates. And another thing that can compound this is a lack of access to some basic nutrients like calcium, iron, vitamin C. Those are all things that can increase lead concentrations in the blood. And I want people to keep that in mind from a justice perspective, because we're going to come back to that. So let's talk about lead poisoning versus exposure. Again, in the spirit of not scaring people and only providing accurate information, a lot of times when people think about lead exposure, they think about lead poisoning. Your eyes are turning yellow, you're having seizures, you've got to go to the hospital right away. That's not what most of us have to deal with, because most of us aren't being exposed to huge amounts of lead at once. But we are being exposed to small amounts of lead. And we've just learned that there's no safe level of lead in the water, because there's no safe level of lead to be exposed to in the bloodstream. And even low levels can lead to significant health effects over life, particularly for people who are exposed as young children. So let's look at some of those health effects. And again, these are health effects that you see even at pretty low levels. This is for adults. You've got headache, irritability, aggressive behavior, difficulty sleeping, abdominal constipation, reduced appetite, and anemia. But for children, it gets even more serious. Oops. For some reason it's not showing up, but that's okay. Children are under the age of 6 are especially susceptible to lead levels. Studies are showing that for formula-fed infants, lead in drinking water can account for up to 60% of their overall exposure to lead. So that's more than half, which means if we got rid of lead in drinking water, we could potentially reduce exposure for formula-fed babies by more than half. We've already talked about how pregnancy and early childhood development are affected most by lead. And again, the problem is that standard for lead in drinking water is higher than what we know is actually safe. And this is just a statistic to drive that home. So even though that standard for lead in water is 15 parts per billion, 3.7 parts per billion, almost a third of that is when we start seeing formula-fed babies consuming lead through their drinking water at higher risk for elevated blood lead levels. And again, what's the safe number of lead in drinking water? None. Thank you. So this seems like a good moment to talk about what happened in Flint, Michigan, and to differentiate the problem that we're facing here with the problem that happened in Flint. So I'm going to show you a quick video, one, so you get a break from me talking, and two, because it does a better job of explaining it than I would in just 3 minutes. Oh, and I'm going to do a new share because I forgot to share sound.
Shocking enough.
Would you drink that? People have dumped in this river forever.
American City failed to provide basic protections to its citizens, and now the children of Flint have much higher than normal levels of lead in their blood. Rick Snyder, governor of Michigan, has apologized.
I am sorry, and I will fix it.
President Obama declared a national emergency.
You can't shortchange basic services that we provide to our people.
And now 2016 presidential candidates are starting to weigh in.
The governor of that state acted as though he didn't really care.
Lead poisoning is terrible and terrifying. No amount of exposure is safe. And there's evidence that years after we got it out of paint, gas, and more, it contributed to a drastic drop in crime in the 90s. The city has switched back to cleaner water, but the effects will last decades. We take clean water for granted. How could this possibly happen in 2016? Well, you've got to rewind to 2011. Flint was broke. It had lost about half its population after the car factories closed. It had $1.1 billion in unfunded pension costs. It had to cut half its police force. Michigan had a solution called emergency managers.
Now he's been appointed by the governor to turn around Flint's finances. Mike, welcome.
These managers can make cost-cutting measures without the normal political procedure.
I think what we have to do is look at the expense side first. There could be services that we can no longer provide in the city.
And they decided the city could save money on water. Flint would stop buying water from Detroit and join a new regional water system. And as a temporary measure, Flint would use water from the Flint River. The switch happened in 2014.
Here's the Flint.
And who decided to do this exactly is under intense debate. But regardless of blame, the story gets worse. Residents saw and tasted the dirty water and started complaining.
Water's brown, has a bad odor. I'm afraid to even feed it to my cat or my dogs.
We should not have to pay for the water. It's nasty.
But the city claimed federal tests showed the water was safe. An employee at the Environmental Protection Agency leaked a Michigan report to a local activist, which showed the water had higher than normal lead levels. The city's response? Flint told the woman the lead came from her plumbing. It took an outside investigation by Virginia Tech researchers that found elevated lead levels in the water for the state to admit there was a problem in September 2015.
So the corrosion's eating up the pipes, it's eating up the iron pipes, it's causing main breaks, it's causing discolored water, and about 20% of the homes there's just too much lead.
In October 2015, the government bought water filters for its citizens and switched back to water from Detroit. Before all this, 2.1% of the city's children had high blood lead levels. After, it was 4%. For kids under 5 in the most affected zip codes, it was 6.3%. Why did Flint poison its citizenry? Under emergency managers from the state, it wanted to save money. To start to reverse the effects will cost dearly. Just switching back to Detroit's water cost $12 million. A class action lawsuit against the city is pending.
So I share that because oftentimes when I do these presentations, people want to know, well, is that kind of the level of an issue that we're dealing with? And the answer is not really. So there are some things in common with Flint, right? We have old lead service lines. That's the case across the country, millions of them. But what we don't have in common is the fact that Flint switched water sources to a source of water that frankly probably shouldn't have been dealt with to begin with. That's not the case in Massachusetts. We have good water, as we've learned. They didn't add corrosion control for years. That's also not the case. All the cities that I know of in Massachusetts that I've worked with are already using corrosion control. But what we do have in common is that we have old lead service lines. And it means that this is always a risk, no matter how much cities are on top of corrosion control, no matter how much public education we do. The reality is that small amounts of lead are being introduced into lead in drinking water, and that's not going to stop until we get the lead out. And before we talk about how to do that, I want to talk about some of the additional complications for children who are exposed when they're kids. That includes hearing loss, kidney damage, reduced IQ, loss of development skills, behavior and attention problems, and slowed body growth. So again, final solution, we've got to get the lead out. And that should seem pretty simple. And actually, this seems like a good moment for a call and response, just to make sure everyone's awake. Can we say, get the lead out? Nice. So in theory, that's simple, right? We know we have lead, we dig it up, we get rid of it. We're good to go home. I wish. The problem is, well, there are a few problems. Number one, it costs money. It's expensive for everyone. The public side, and the other issue is that lead service lines are technically owned by two parties. Half is owned by the city. So everything from the sidewalk to the street, that's the city's responsibility to replace. Everything from the property boundary to the house has historically been the responsibility of homeowners to replace. That can cost generally between $3,000 to $7,000, with $5,000 being the average they're seeing in greater Boston area. So this is where we get into the social justice aspects. $3,000 to $7,000, that's a lot of money for really kind of everyone right now, especially with what we're going through with unemployment and COVID and the cost of everything. And it means that for people who don't have that money, they in the city are faced with a choice, which is basically, do you get rid of half the line that the city owns and leave the half for the property owner to deal with later? Do you leave it all on the ground? What do you do? And the other issue is that renters really don't have any control over that one way or the other. Landlords are not always responsive even to basic problems like, mold or drafty windows, much less spending thousands of dollars to replace pipes that filter water that they're not going to drink. And the other issue is that municipal budgets are determined largely by property taxes, local sales tax, and the hospitality industry, which basically means that the richest communities are going to have the money to replace lead service lines faster, both on the public and the private side. Like I said, this is a presentation about lead service lines, not lead in schools, but people ask about it. So I also want to point out that school budgets are also partially determined by local taxes, and that leaves a discrepancy of up to over $10,000 a year per student. So this is an issue in schools and in homes, where the people with the access to the most resources are the people who are going to be able to replace their lead service lines the fastest. And that's the big issue because partial replacement is not a great idea. Partial replacement refers to the practice of only replacing half of a lead service line, usually due to that mixed ownership where the city owns half and the property owner owns the other half. The issue is, going back to that straw metaphor, imagine that I took half of that straw, broke it in half, put half of a clean straw on and handed you back the glass and said, "You're welcome." Problem's not really fixed yet, is it? And whenever you disturb an old lead pipe, you risk knocking loose more of those lead particles that travel directly through the water and into your body. So that means that the problem in the short term is actually elevated, and in the long term, it's not completely fixed and is still going to need to be addressed years later. So why does this happen? I want to call your attention to a study that American University did recently. So this was also a big issue in DC where they had a lot of lead service lines. What they found is across the board, property owners only paid for full lead service line replacement 50% of the time. And I'm going to stop there and just say that's not an acceptable level to begin with. Leaving half of the lead for half of the people in the ground to deal with later is just going to cause more problems in the long term. And frankly, it's going to cost us as a society more over time. So that's a problem to begin with. But when you start looking at race and you start looking at class, what they found is that in the wealthiest wards, that rate jumped to 66% compared to 25% for the wards with the lowest incomes. They also found a really strong correlation, even more than class, with race, where in the wards with the two wards with the lowest median household income and the highest percentage of African American and Black residents, residential service lines were only voluntarily replaced 0.1% of the time. That's basically nothing. And it's really not acceptable. So as an advocate, I've worked with enough communities to know that the ideal solution is to find ways to pay for the entire cost of the lead service line, so that homeowners either don't have to pay that cost at all, or they have options to repay that cost slowly over time in a way that's accessible to everyone. But this isn't just a problem for the cities. And I really want to talk about this because it can be difficult as an environmental organization establishing trust with cities, because they get a lot of flack for a problem that's frankly a lot bigger than just the city level. So we have stopped investing in our infrastructure across the board. You've probably been hearing a lot about this on the national level. In 1977, we spent $76 per person on water infrastructure. In 2014, we were only spending $11 per person. That means that state and local governments are bearing the burden of 96% of all public spending on water and wastewater utilities. And that inevitably creates a system where the poorest communities keep getting poorer and poorer results in terms of financial access to things that would improve their health long term. And this is a major social justice issue in so many ways. I want to name a few of the movements that I think we should be allying with more closely on lead in drinking water, because what affects us affects those movements, and how those movements think about the environment as part of their own work will only make all of our campaigns and goals stronger. So this is a reproductive justice issue. Pregnancy and early childhood development are affected most by lead exposure, and that can include spontaneous miscarriages, meaning that women of color, women from lower income backgrounds, immigrants are being exposed to lead at higher levels and having a harder time carrying pregnancies forward. Education and incarceration. In children, symptoms of lead exposure include impacts on attention and IQ. So what does that mean in areas where children are already getting pushed out of school, pushed into prisons, particularly if they're children of color? And this doesn't just end with kids. In adults, lead exposure manifests in irritability and aggressive behavior. There are people who still think that the major reduction in crime in the 90s was because we got lead out of gasoline and it made people less aggressive. So given that infrastructure relies on city budgets, and city budgets rely on the wealth of their residents, what does it mean for members of community that are both under-resourced and over-policed? And this is also just fundamentally an economic justice issue. It's not just that lead is bad for you, it's also expensive. In fact, the Lead Service Line Replacement Collaborative thinks that there are $22,000 in benefits per lead service line replaced, just in cardiovascular benefits alone, because lead raises your blood pressure significantly and puts people in the hospital with cardiac issues. And I think this quote really drives it home. Year after year, we see persistent gaps in achievement based on race and income level. These gaps do not stem from disparate ability. Rather, they are the result of systems designed to perpetuate injustice. And doing this work, I've come to believe that part of that injustice is literally in the systems that are physically built, like our infrastructure. And it's why we talk about environmental justice. Environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color, and environmental justice is the movement to respond to that. And I just want to point out, this isn't just about race, it's also about class and about language access. The way we define environmental justice in Massachusetts is communities with high numbers of people of color, high numbers of low income people, and people who are English isolated, which means that there is not someone in the home who is an adult who can easily read and process information that is key to protecting their health. And this plays out exactly like you think it would. Like I said before, Black children are still twice as likely as non-Black children to have elevated lead levels currently. And as we started gathering data across Massachusetts, we see a similar pattern. I can say just kind of anecdotally, when I work with communities, it's precisely communities with higher percentages of people of color, lower income people, and English isolated people that tend to have the highest number of lead service lines that need to get replaced. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because people who have the money to deal with this issue quickly and cities that have the money to deal with this issue quickly are going to. No one actually wants to be exposed to lead. The question is, how do we get resources to communities to make sure that they don't have to be? So this is a map of Greater Boston. And I want to say the reason that you're not seeing maps of Mystic Valley is because, unfortunately, we don't yet have all of the lead service line information that we need to actually create maps like this in all of the different cities. Malden actually has a pretty good online lead map, which we're going to talk about later, but that wasn't the case for all of Mystic Valley yet. And when we start breaking this down, and all the credit goes to our intern NG who gathered all of this data. Yeah, like actually round of applause. This is really impressive work. Yeah. What they found was that there was a statistically significant correlation between the rate of lead service line replacement, which means the percent of lead service lines replaced per year, and race, in particular for Black and African American people. So let's look at a city like, let's look at a city like Mattapan, where only 22% of residents are not Black or African American. Only 15% of lead service lines were replaced that year. But let's look at a place like Alston or Brighton, where 93% of residents are not Black or African American. Their rate was nearly double. Similar for Fenway, Kenmore, similar for Jamaica Plain. And so we're seeing, again, this statistically significant correlation where communities of color are getting their lead service lines replaced at lower rates. And that was independent of median household income, which I also think is important. I'm not a data scientist, so I actually really want to partner with academic institutions to understand more about these correlations. But I think it's important, and I think we need to be talking about it more. So I'm ready to talk solutions, and I hope you are too. But before we do that, I want to just really lay this out as clearly as possible and talk about this cycle of injustice. So you've got a lack of access and choice to safe housing. And here I'm defining safe by, it doesn't have a lead service line. This leads people to often live in older homes that often have aging lead service lines. if someone is experiencing lack of access to basic nutrition and also doesn't have the ability or the authority to replace the private side of their lead service line, they're being exposed to lead at higher levels. And again, that lack of access to nutrition, I think, is really important, where then those people kind of are experiencing this double effect of both being exposed to lead and having that lead exposure be more significant because they're not accessing basic nutrition. This leads to effects on the individual and communal level, adding a lot of really serious costs to the individual. So what do we do about it? Say it for me. Thank you. So now we know what we need to do. The question is, how do we do it? Thank you. I was waiting for someone to laugh. So before we get into solutions, I want to talk about a couple of other issues that I've run into as an advocate. Number one is the inventory. It's really the most serious thing. It's what you'll hear me talk about all day. We don't know where the lead is, and we really need to. And that's going to be everyone's responsibility. It's my responsibility as an advocate to talk about it. It's the city's responsibility to make that information available when they know where it is. And it's our responsibility to do our part and find out whether or not we live in homes connected to lead service lines. That can be particularly difficult to renters where they don't have access to the basement where they could find that lead service line. And that's also difficult and scary for immigrants. When I worked in Chelsea, a lot of people didn't want to open the door for anyone connected with the government because they were worried about ICE raids. So that's another example where community members like me can help out because I'm not a government official. And sometimes people are a little bit more comfortable talking to me. So got a little bit harder, but that's okay. And one last thing, even though it's hard, it's possible, it's necessary, and it's a really, really good idea, and not just for the reasons you might think. These are some estimates for what could happen if we replaced all of the lead service lines in the country for the next 10 years. $205 billion saved just in cardiovascular disease related illness. And then they add they add another $2 billion in, I believe, for IQ benefits, which are not completely calculated because really, how can you? But really for me, the question is, what could our children, particularly children of color, be doing if they weren't both being impacted by racism in schools, but also cognitive and behavioral issues associated with lead exposure? So now this is my favorite part. Let's talk solutions. So the ultimate goal is, thank you. I'm gonna keep doing it. It's gonna be annoying. So you should probably just do it faster so we get through it. We also have some intermediate steps. So one of them is what's happening right now. It's public education. It's me talking to you, letting you know that this is an issue, telling you how you can protect yourself in the short term, and then how you can organize in your own communities to get the lead out in the long term. And we're going to go through these solutions one by one. And the good news is this isn't just happening on individual levels. Change is really coming. I have been doing this for a few years now. I don't think there's ever been a better time for lead in drinking water. Money is opening up on the federal and state level, and it's allowing communities, especially environmental justice communities, to do more with more resources to get the lead out. And the strategy, the reason why I started doing these community presentations is it kind of works like dominoes, where if we establish trust in one community and we come up with solutions and that community is able to replace their lead service lines faster, I then get to talk about that in another community. And then I get to brag about that community to a different one. And slowly but surely, we see this momentum growing where more community members are involved, we're connecting folks with resources, and the more success we see in one community, the more other places know that this is possible for them too. And we can also let people know that there's more help available sometimes that they know. So in Massachusetts, we have something awesome called the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority Fund. It still has millions of dollars left that provide zero interest loans to communities that want to cover the full cost of replacement. Something similar called the State Revolving Loan Fund. We obviously help with community engagement like we're doing right now. And there's also new research coming out all the time about the best ways to handle this as quickly as possible. And nationally, there's some really exciting stuff happening. Arpa funding, which is currently being worked out in the House and the Senate, hopefully soon. The Senate version at least includes another $175 million to the Clean Water Trust, which gives out loans and grants, including for stuff like lead service line replacement. And that's not including some of the ARPA funding that municipalities receive directly. You've also got the bipartisan infrastructure bill that just passed. That includes $15 billion for lead service line replacement. That's one of the biggest investments in water infrastructure ever, and certainly in recent history. The Build Back Better Act has not passed yet. It's passed the House, but it's still waiting in the Senate. But if the House version passes as is in the Senate, that includes another $10 billion for lead service lines and lead in schools. The lead and copper rule, that rule that established the 15 parts per billion as the lead in drinking water standard, is also changing. Unfortunately, they didn't end up lowering that action level, but they did establish a lower level where people have to start doing public education. And they're also likely to require an inventory from all communities, which is essential. And there are also changes to plumbing standards where they're going to start labeling plumbing differently so that people know that it's been certified as lead-free or in compliance with the plumbing standards that were established in 1984. And in the state, we've got some really good things happening. I've already talked about the MWRA program and the State Revolving Fund. One thing that I want to shout out, especially for those of you who have kids in daycare and schools, Mass DEP is providing free comprehensive technical assistance. So that includes testing of water and helping daycares and schools strategize for how to get that lead out. I really encourage you to reach out to your school or your childcare provider and just ask them, hey, I heard about this free program with DEP. Have you used it? What do you know about lead in my kid's school or daycare? It's super easy to do, and you're always welcome to contact us if you want help. And locally, there are cities who have been able to commit to full replacement, meaning that they cover the cost of the private lead service line at zero cost to the homeowner. Places like Quincy, Chelsea, Somerville, and others are doing that. And we want others to follow in their footsteps. So what do we do about this though? Number one, find out if you have a lead service line. Get your water tested for free if you can. And you can also check your home on your own with something called epa.gov/PYT, protect your tap. And it's a new online resource that lets you go through your own basement and basically click on these different choice answers online. And at the end, it will tell you whether or not you likely have a lead service line, whether or not you likely don't, and give you some basic next steps. And you can also check your own water service line if you're interested in some citizen science. All you need is access to your basement, a pair of keys, and a magnet. If you scratch that pipe lightly, don't puncture it, lightly scratch it, and it scratches easily, that's likely lead. That's because it's soft and bendy, like we've learned. You can also take a magnet and stick it on. If the magnet doesn't stick, it's also likely lead. But it's always worth following up with your local water provider or city and asking them to test that lead line for you. You're also doing them a favor because it's letting them gather that information and keep more accurate records now that we know we should be doing that. This is a script, and I've got lots of scripts printed out for people with some specific information for your local municipality that we're going to get into later. But it's really as simple as calling and saying, hey, I heard about lead in drinking water. I'm kind of worried about it. What do you have to tell me? If you know you have a lead service line, run your tap in the morning. This is a really easy way to significantly reduce your exposure to lead. That's because as water sits inside the pipe, the longer it sits there, the longer it has an opportunity to collect particles of lead. When you run the tap in the morning and they say for 1 to 3 minutes, my advice is to wait until the water gets as cold as possible. Then you know that that's new water that hasn't been sitting. And if you're like me and you hate wasting water, I'm from the desert, so I really, really hate wasting water. Use that water to water plants, not plants that you'll eat. So don't water your tomato plants, don't water your herbs, but pretty plants that you look at, totally fine to water with that. You can also wash the car or use it for any other use where you're not drinking it or introducing it directly into your body. Only cook with cold water. Cold water is less likely to contain lead, and do not, repeat, do not boil your water. It's a really natural instinct to want to boil your water because it seems like it'll make it cleaner. But in the case of lead, when you boil water, steam happens. So you're losing water. So you're losing your concentration of water and you're actually increasing your concentration of lead. So don't boil the water. It's one of the worst things you can do. You can come in, person in the window. Yeah. Great. Use a filter. If you know that your water contains lead, invest in a filter. I can't tell you which one because I work for an environmental nonprofit and that would be a conflict of interest and they don't want us to get rich out of selling you water filters. So do your own research. There's plenty of credible resources online. And then choose the right filter. It really does filter a large amount of lead out of your drinking water and creates a lot of peace of mind. So let's do a quick recap. If you know you're connected to a lead service line, is it better to use hot water or cold water? Nice. Should you boil it? No. Should you look for a filter? Yes. What should you do in the morning when the water's been sitting overnight? You guys are awesome. You're on top of it already. All right. And the last thing we do, and this is when we start wrapping up and breaking out into community groups, we organize. We organize to, what do we want to do? Yes, we do. One more time, like a little more force. Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Here are some really easy ways that you can organize that don't take a whole bunch of time. Like I said, one conversation, one call to your local water department. That's what starts the conversation. That's what gets things going. Number one, is there information about lead service lines? And is there an inventory? Can folks see the inventory? Also a very important question. Do they offer free water testing and lead service line inspection? Is there clear information for how to find out if you're connected to a lead service line? If that's assuming they don't have a published inventory. And does funding exist to help you replace that private side of the lead service line? These are the key questions that we want to ask every single city and town to see whether or not we're set up to actually get the lead out. And so we made a little report card for each community in the Mystic Valley area. And this should give you an idea of what you want to do moving forward. So in Arlington, we didn't find a lot of information. The good news is that Arlington, from my research, doesn't seem to have a ton of lead service lines, but there might be other sources of lead out there. So I think that every city should have publicly available information, even if that information is, we're all good, don't worry about it. I still think people should get to know that. So a lot of things you can call Arlington and bother them about. Ask them for information on lead service lines. Ask them if there's an inventory. Ask if you can see it. Ask if they do water testing. All of that stuff. Waiting. Everett, a little bit better. There is information about lead service lines on the municipal website. Again, plenty of papers to send you home with that information. There is an inventory. People can't see it online yet, and that really is the gold standard. And one example that we have of that gold standard locally is right here in Malden. If you go online, I'll send you the link in a second. You can find out whether or not you have a lead service line right now if you live in Malden. they don't have information for everything yet. So if you see unknown, it's really important that you call your local water department and ask them to perform that test. They'll do it for free. Back to Everett. Unknown if they offer free water testing and lead service line inspection. I couldn't find a clear answer just by searching on their website. And that's kind of the standard I use, because I figure if I, as an advocate that spend like hours a day researching lead, can't find information, it's probably not accessible to your average local resident. There wasn't clear information for how to find out if you're connected to a lead service line, but we do know that Everett's been taking MWRA money, so funding to assist with private side replacement does exist. So it's kind of interesting, like the thing we want most, Everett seems to have, but information for how to actually get there is a little bit lacking. So if you're from Everett, that's what I would focus on. Can I get a show of hands for, is there anyone from Everett here? Okay, I have a feeling it's a lot of Malden folks. How many people here are from Malden? Awesome. So questions for Malden. There is information about lead service line, tons of it. I've been working with Maria Louise and others for years. It's been awesome. There's an inventory. You can see it online. Check out if you have a lead service line. Come see me after if you're not sure how. They offer free water testing and lead service line inspection. Do both, because if you have a lead service line, you want to kind of establish how much lead is in the drinking water. Also, that varies from day to day. So just because you get a low lead test, if you know you're connected to a lead service line, it's still an issue and you still need to find a way to get it replaced. There is some funding to assist private side replacement in the form of loans for homeowners. I really want to be able to get Malden to the place where they can cover private side replacement for everyone who needs it. And I know Malden is also working really hard to make that happen. So in this case, I'm going to say keep encouraging them to look for all possible solutions to this issue. Malden has the highest number of lead service lines in Eastern Massachusetts, which means that they've got a long way to go, but we're really working hard out here. So do your part by checking your lead service line, joining community meetings like this, so we can keep pushing them as fast as possible. Anyone from Medford? Raise your hand if you're from Medford. Awesome. So there is some information about lead service lines on the municipal website. I could not find an inventory. They do offer free water testing and inspection. So feel free to see me after and I'll leave you with some information for how to do that lead service line inspection. There's not clear information about how to find out if you're connected to a lead service line, except that they offer the inspection. And that information was kind of hard to find on the website. So I did a little bit of digging to pull it out. And there is funding to assist private side replacement. They'll reimburse up to $1,000. So that's not all the way, but I've never turned down $1,000 personally, and I wouldn't advise you to either. Is anyone from Winchester? No, Vincent's from Winchester. Yes.
Briefly is the fact that the records might go back.
Yeah.
And I can record somewhere, but not the records that one time, beautiful town, South Woburn, and you build a factory. And it has all kinds of quite beautiful today, but there's still factories. One of the things a lot of people don't realize is that oftentimes
Gotcha.
Turned out that decades before, all sites of the tests are used rare earth.
Wow.
So it turned out there were dozens of rare earth around. Turned out to be site, and that's somebody. No, it may not. So these areas of that more ultimately public all those people are interested, all should be interested in tracking this, should be advised first, try to figure out how people working groups talk about developing, develop pathways to those records, records from 50 or 100 years ago that may still exist somewhere in an archive, may well have beautiful insights exactly what was done, when it was done. Very much current and future looking society, but this is the case of our your may well help to save some lives and establish some sort of safety.
Amen. So if you live in Winchester, you were very lucky to have Vincent, who is already on the case. So start working with him. Yeah, Cindy. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There are two particularities to that. One is that without going into too much of the back of the house detail, it's sensitive. There is money that is in the federal bill that will be specifically coming from Walden for those issues. Congresswoman Clark is also the assistant speaker, so she's one of the top 6 leaders of the House of Representatives. And that's important. She's been very, I think less than 15 years ago, she was only running for school committee. So she's actually risen quite quickly, very constituent oriented. There's a fellow on her staff named Wade Blackman, who is constituent oriented on some of these issues. And I've talked to him. Don't forget that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts does have its own funds coming through the federal arena. And whatever you think, the legislature basically stopped formal session until January without coming to an agreement on these things. Jason Lewis is the state senator. Representative Altrino is, I believe, a representative here, and they should be, their offices should be contacted and saying it's very important that the state pass through from the federal money be done, because this is money that's now available. So there's the state money that's federal pass through. There are state standards. There's federal money, and if the Build Back Better bill passes, there may be some other money for that. But the most important federal money is the one that was just signed into law earlier this week.
Yep, exactly.
I'd be happy to talk further.
Yeah, thank you, Vince. And I'm going to move us on a little bit because I want to leave some time for action. I want to be respectful of all your time. Anyone from Woburn? All right, great. We're gonna skip Woburn then. So we've come to the end. We're about to take action together. Few things you can do right now. You can become a clean water volunteer. I will send you all out the links. Basically, what that means is that you get onto our email list so that when there are really local opportunities, keyword local, to engage, you're the first to know about it. So that could look like holding one of these presentations yourself, inviting me to your kid's school, inviting me to your, I don't know, after hour drinks. I don't really care. I'll present anywhere. Get the lead out of schools. MassPIRG, one of our partners, is currently running an effort to pass legislation that would create more funding on the state level to help schools remediate their lead problem. Number 3, the Build Back Better Act. We had a huge victory by passing that infrastructure bill. We need its partner, which is the Build Back Better Act. Clean Water Action currently has something online where you can send an email to your senators with 1 click. You can also tweet at them, letting them know that they need to get this done. Needless to say, I think it's really important that we put as much pressure as we can to get this money freed up. And I just want to end by sharing a success story because I know this can be kind of daunting. I started working in Chelsea in 2018. We had our first meeting with Chelsea Green Roots, awesome grassroots partners like Malden Corps, mobilizing people of color like the NAACP. A couple days later, we had our first meeting with the city. In October, we held an event like this. In November, they got a loan approved. We went door to door the next year to get people to check their lead service lines and let them know they were eligible to have them replaced for free. And in September 2019, they've done construction. Even though Chelsea only had 93 lead service lines on record, they've currently replaced over 400. And frankly, Malden is another great success story. Marie and I have been working together on this for 3 years now. We've found opportunities to apply for money. We've done public education. And I think we even have a few more people here than last time, including online, which is pretty incredible in a pandemic. So yeah, this works, y'all. All we need is a few people to get the conversation started. So with that in mind, I'm going to end the presentation. I'm going to come down and start distributing calling scripts so that you can call your local water department right now would be great. Leave them a message for Monday to get your water tested, to get your lead service line tested. And I've also brought our Clean Water Action banner. I've brought some signs if people want to take some quick photos to say hashtag what? Yeah, one more time. All right, and that's what I need you to tell all your friends and family when you get home. Get the lead out, get your water tested, get your water service line tested. The more of you that are engaged, the more of you that are checking your own lead service lines, talking with the city, finding options, the faster we're gonna get rid of the problem and get the lead out. So thank you for coming and doing your part today, and I'm excited to work with all of you in the future. And I think I'm gonna ask NG and maybe Cindy and Paulina, also hi Cindy and Paulina, my awesome colleagues. Hello, if you can start passing out some of these papers. And I wanna spend a little bit of time with folks on Zoom to see what's happening in the chat, and then I'll come down. Great. And I'll stay on Zoom for a little bit. Is there anyone here who does not yet know if they're connected to a lead service line? So you don't know what your water service line is made out of. All right, Alan, I want to connect with you. Is there anyone here who knows that they do have a lead service line? Okay, awesome, awesome. I want to talk to both of you as well. Okay. Okay, where do you live? Malden? Okay, yeah. Are you a homeowner or a renter? Okay, yeah, let's talk and see if there are any more resources than the last time you talked to folks. Yep. Got you. Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to talk to you one-on-one because we also have a focus group exactly for people like you who are having trouble coming up with the money so that we can basically gather all of those responses and then think of solutions and talk to the city about it. Thank you. Who has their phone on them where they can take a couple of quick actions online? Yeah, awesome. Willing to do it? Yay. All right, let's do it. Let's start with the Build Back Better Act. So you can go to this link. I think if you also just Google Build Back Better Act Clean Water, it'll come up. If you could just raise your hands when you've got it up. Oh, got you. If there's not, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's, I don't know the Wi-Fi. Yeah, they're gonna put it on, yeah. All right. And is there anyone here who would be interested in taking some pictures with Get the Let Out sign that you can post on your own social media and we can also post on our social media? Yeah, awesome. Awesome. Thank you. All right, let's get that going. All right, folks on Zoom, do you have any last questions? And if you're on Zoom, you're gonna get those same packets that I handed out by email to the email address that you were registered at. And also, did you already put the action alerts in the chat by any chance? Yeah, up here. Okay, and also NG is going to put some of the links in the chat and you'll get them by email as well. And then I will close y'all out in a few minutes and feel free to ask any questions in the meantime. And people in the audience, you're welcome to ask me questions too. I can multitask. Yeah, we have a Clean Water YouTube account that I think we'll get it onto, and we haven't discussed with NAACP yet where you all will put it. And I believe, Maria, you said you'd put it on the Malden website as well. So it'll be on the Malden website as well. Yep. You can email me at you can email me, you have my email, but let me send out an email to everyone who registered too. Yeah. And you can also, if you go to our website, you'll see my contact information there as well. Yeah. All right, so picture takers, if you would come join me in the front, and Zoom folks, I'm going to close you out. Thank you so much.